Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you through the stories and the worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, the brunette, Guido.
And me, the blonde, Rob. Oh, and look, we've got a redhead who just can't decide between the two of us. He doesn't know which way to go. It's author, expert, and returning guest, Tim Hanley. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks so much for having me back, guys.
Tim, did you realize that the three of us have the right hair color for this episode?
I did not, but that was a perfect introduction. Well done.
Well, Tim, for our listeners who don't know him because they missed his previous appearances, is an author, historian, and comic book expert. Most recently, he wrote Not All Supermen, Sexism, Toxic Masculinity, and the Complex History of Superheroes, which we got to talk with him in depth about way back in episode 60 last August. He also wrote the essential history book of Wonder Woman called Wonder Woman Unbound, as well as books on Catwoman, Lois Lane, and the subjects of today's episode, Betty and Veronica. And you can also hear Tim join us for our first coverage of the multiverse of DC Comics bombshells back on episode 75 in December 2022. So welcome back, Tim.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this is exciting because you're taking us into a part of the world we don't know very well. So I don't know very well. Rob knows a little better than me, but no one knows as well as you. So yes. That's exciting.
Well, before we get our malteds, Guido, and begin our trip, what's new in our little section of the multiverse?
Well, we've still got that Marvel giveaway going on because it is our summer of giveaways to celebrate our 100 episodes and our 2-year anniversary. We do have 2 more bundle giveaways coming at listeners throughout the summer, so just keep listening every week to find out more. We're also getting closer. It is now officially less than 3 months to New York Comic Con. So if you plan to be there, let us know. We'll be there with lots of stickers, with our fancy new t-shirts and so much stuff. And we just love the chance to see people in person. So that's exciting.
We will see you there. And if you are seeing us here on the podcast for the first time or hearing us, then we have 3 parts of our journey today. Origins of the story, what inspired this other reality, exploring multiversity, we dive deeper into our alternate universe, and pondering possibilities, we examine the impact and what's followed or coming in the future.
And remember, leave a review wherever you're listening. It helps us. And you can also post on social media. Thank you.
And with that, dear watchers, welcome to episode 106, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe. Today, we head to Pop's Chocolate Shop, the nexus of all realities by way of Gotham City, to find out the answer to the question, what if Archie Comics Betty and Veronica met DC Comics Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy?
And this Earth is one in which Gotham City and Riverdale just coexist. And we will find out a lot more about this Earth, which seems to only exist in the series we looked at today. But before we get into all of the stories we looked at, Tim is going to give us some background on Betty and Veronica.
Yeah, so we all know Archie Comics. We see them at the grocery store and the checkout line. But Archie Comics wasn't always Archie Comics. It started as MLJ Comics in the early 40s, and they were mainly a superhero publisher, heroes like The Shield and Black Hood, because after Superman, everyone wanted a superhero. That was the big boom. And then Archie premiered in the very back of Pep Comics number 22 in 1941. Pep was the Shield's main feature. And the editor, John Goldwater, tried to diversify the slate a little bit because you got to fill what were like 70-page anthologies every month. So Archie was a creation of Goldwater, and more than Goldwater was what's his name? Bob Montana. I was thinking Bob Kane for a second, and that's the other guys. So yeah, Bob Montana grew up in a small town, went to a high school a lot like Riverdale High, based a lot of the characters on his own experiences there. So Betty Cooper, the kind-hearted blonde girl next door, debuted in this very first Archie story and was immediately infatuated with Archie. he was trying to show off for her. He was riding the handlebars of a bicycle, walking up on a fence.
As one does.
Yeah. Then there was some shenanigans involving a charity festival. She volunteered Archie to be a tightrope walker because the tightrope walker had to cancel. She'd seen him on the fence. She thought, this is going to work great. He fell into the taffy machine. Taffy went everywhere. He and Jughead had to rush at it. It was a whole situation. So really kind of establishing the slapstick components that we all know and love in Archie Comics from the get-go, and then having Betty there at the very start. It took, I think, 4 or 5 months later, Veronica showed up. Was this rich heiress from out of town, very, very different than Betty, intentionally so, and gave a different flair to the stories. Betty was very much in love with Archie from the get-go. She would be part of the adventures, but kind of just going along with it. Veronica took him into new, more uncomfortable territories for the young lad. He had to try to impress her, had to try to win her over. And Veronica quickly became the more popular character. Betty really faded into the background through the 40s. She came back a bit in the early 1950s. Betty and Veronica got their own comic book called Archie's Girls, Betty and Veronica, so you can kind of guess what the focus was there. It was all dating hijinks again. Veronica always won in the 1950s. Whatever was at stake, Veronica got Archie. Betty always lost. She became kind of this perennial sad sack. She would frequently complain about being second fiddle and having no shot against Veronica. And so in the 1960s, it slowly begins to change. We'll talk about this a little bit more with Betty and Me, her own solo series. But Betty starts to come to the fore more than she did before. And then we start to see the shift for Veronica from always winning, kind of, vain and not the kindest character, to shifting full on into villain mode. That would continue through the 1970s and into the 80s. Then we get a relaunch in the late 80s that kind of shifts focus back to their friendship and kind of gets to the core of who the characters are when they work best together. Like the best Betty and Veronica stories all through Archie history are the ones where they're pals and having adventures and not at each other's throats all the time. So that's kind of been the main focus since, is their friendship. The Archie relaunch was almost a decade ago now, wasn't it? It was like 2015.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of strayed away from it, has since returned. Riverdale is the biggest thing for Archie lately, and the friendship between Betty and Veronica has been central to that show in all of its seasons. So yeah, 2 iconic characters created as if they were meant to be icons. Like Blonde Girl Next Door, Brunette Rich Girl was a perfect setup. They've remained the same ever since, but with fluctuations over the decades.
Well, I know another thing that I think was influenced them, right, Tim, was the Andy Hardy series at the time, and you had Judy Garland as the girl next door who never ended up with Andy, and he always was ending up with another girl, so maybe that she was the Betty very much of that situation there.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a ton of these kind of teen comedy strips in the early 1940s, even at MLJ before they became Archie Comics. They had a bunch of different characters trying to do the same thing. Archie's just the one that hit, largely because they were able to translate it into a successful radio show throughout the 1940s. So that helped a lot.
And Betty and Veronica were characters on that, I'm assuming?
Yeah, background characters more, because the show very quickly became like a situation comedy centered around the Andrews household. So Mr. and Mrs. Andrews were second only to Archie in terms of like their airtime on the show. Betty and Veronica would show up, and even then they were very kind of flat characters. Same as always, Betty was in love with Veronica, or with Archie. Veronica didn't care about the boy that much.
Maybe Veronica too.
Maybe. And they'd show up. Archie would ignore Betty. He'd fall over himself for Veronica, and that was kind of the shtick every week.
Well, that's a little.
I love in your work the way that you're always looking in Not All Superman and in Wonder Woman Unbound and in Investigating Lois Lane at the way the change in culture is reflected in these characters. And I'm sure that you can really map that onto Betty and Veronica, which I'm excited to do in this episode. But before we get into stories, I wanted to see what your personal background with Betty and Veronica is. Why do you like them, or when did you first encounter them, or what's your personal background?
Yeah, Archie Comics were the first comics I ever got into, like even before superheroes. My grandmother used to buy me comics at yard sales and stuff, so I still have stacks of old Archies. So that was really my entry into comics as a whole. And I think they're very funny. Because in getting the old ones, I got a lot of like the 1960s Harry Lucy, super slapstick, excellent Archie comics that are, I think, legitimately hilarious. And so that was my entry into it, and I've loved them ever since. Every year when I go, like, I try to take a week off in the summer to go read some books. And if you go to Walmart and you get 3 Archies, they'll give you a deal. It's usually like 3 for $10. Tip for all the listeners out there. And yeah, you just dig into the new stories, the old stories. They're just simple and funny, and I really enjoy them. And then as a historian, to look back on them, it's like, oh, this is what these middle-aged white creators thought teenagers were like. And especially teenage girls, and to see it through that lens is fascinating when you can kind of sit back and peel the digests apart a bit. The digests are stories all glommed together from different eras. So when you can look back and piece it all out and see how the characters evolve, it turns into a very, very interesting story.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, too, that you said in, I think, the very first appearance, there's this tightrope and walking, and I believe there was like a trend at the time. Hey, this was pre-TV, early radio even. I think there was a trend of like tightrope walking as a distraction for people, and that's the big thing about Archie. It always is taking something that happens at the time. I remember, I think I discussed on the other episode, one I was reading from the 70s, and it's all about them getting a pet rock. So as a historian, it must be interesting because you are seeing all these trends, popular trends, and then also larger cultural trends and how they evolve over literally 80 years.
Absolutely. Like, we're going to talk about a superhero story from the 60s. Archie did superhero stories because superheroes were suddenly popular again, and Archie wanted to jump back on it. And then after the superhero craze, they got into other TV show spoofs. There's spoofs of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. There's spoofs of The Monkees that lead directly to the Archies and the whole fictional band and the hit song and all of that. But even beyond pop culture, there's obviously the larger historical things going on. So you get a lot of feminism in the 1970s, but just terribly done. It's, again, middle-aged white men writing these stories. So
exactly.
every feminist quote-unquote story starts with like Archie and Reggie or Mr. Lodge or even Pop Tate being like, man, this feminism, this is a bunch of garbage. What are these women thinking? And the girls will be like, how dare you speak up against feminism? And then in the end often prove Archie and Reggie's point by like fighting with each other instead of
right.
the true feminist values they're trying to espouse. But it's Archie tries to be of the time, but is always a little bit behind the time. So Betty and Veronica like embrace the tenets of feminism by like the early 80s, and you kind of see sort of the old the feminist bashing disappears, and then kind of all the rhetoric they talked about, like girls can do all these things, is just exists now. So like say early in the 1970s, anytime the girls would talk about playing sports, it would be like a big joke, and the coach would be like, no way, and they'd end up not playing it because it was going to mess up their hair. But then by like late 70s, early 80s, they just play sports, and there's no comment on it. It's just what is. So there's this very slow absorption of kind of progress in society that makes its way slowly into Archie Comics.
That's amazing. Well, let's get more into the superheroes that you mentioned, and you can hear Guido and my backstory on Archie Comics, actually back on episode 95 with our frequent guest Ethan, so check that out. But for now, let's get our superhero tights on and fly into point of origin and origins of the story.
I'm going to pull my ponytail to make the transition.
Right now, on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
So this is Betty and Me, issue number 3 from Archie Comics, and that's from August 1966.
And this is, like most comics of its day, not credited, but it's believed the credits are writer Frank Doyle, artist Dan DiCarlo, and inker and possibly letterer Mario Acquaviva. Frank Doyle was the head writer for Archie for over 30 years, writing over 10,000, apparently, Archie stories. And we discussed Dan DiCarlo quite a bit on episode 95 when we talked Josie and the Pussycats. He helped develop the look of Archie, co-created Sabrina and Josie and the Pussycats. So, Tim, you picked this issue for us. Why?
This is a huge turning point for Betty. Archie had kind of dipped their toes into superheroes at this stage. There was a feature in Archie where Archie was Pureheart the Powerful. Jughead was... I forget who Jughead
Captain Hero?
Captain
I think
Hero.
Yeah.
Really creative name there.
Yeah.
I mean, Betty's Superteen, so it's they're not great.
No.
But
Captain Hero would
Frank
work if it was a play on the sandwich.
Yeah, that's
Hero,
that's true.
because
Oh, yeah, that would be.
Oh,
Jughead
nice.
like sandwiches.
Oh,
I
totally.
bet it wasn't that.
No, I
don't
bet
know,
it
maybe.
100% was that. I think you hit it right on the head.
Fun.
I was gonna chalk it up to the poor Frank writing 10,000 stories. There's only so much thought that you can give into these.
I think Frank Doyle is the most prolific comic book writer of all time. Like that man.
No, it sounds like
Frank
it
Doyle Archie
could
stories,
definitely
that's
could be.
So in this era for Betty, as I said earlier, this is kind of like her sad sack era. She never wins. Veronica always outsmarts her. If she tries to be nice and win Archie that way, it doesn't work. If she tries to be tricky and come with some clever ploy to win Archie, that doesn't work either. It just never ever turns in her favor. And she's a sad sack to such an extent that there's one issue where she's kind of getting on Archie's nerves trying to get a date to the dance. He tells her to go jump off like a high cliff or something. He's very annoyed with her. Later in the story, some of the other boys have stolen Archie's clothes, kind of hung them up from the rafters. So Betty has climbed up on the balcony to get them down for Archie. Archie sees it, thinks that she's trying to off herself, as he suggested, by jumping off from a considerable height, and immediately asks her to the dance. And Betty's like, oh, so this is how it works. So the last panel of the comic is Archie and Betty at the dance. And Betty saying, if you don't take me to the boat trip next week, I'm going to shoot myself.
Oh my God.
So this is the kind of desperation we see with
Wow.
poor Betty in this era.
Well,
And,
then it feels. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Yeah, and you can kind of see it in this story too. She's desperate to save Archie, and in the story itself, no one knows that she does. We have 2 different stories where she saves Archie, and then Veronica as well in the second one, and no one knows it's Betty. Archie ends up with Veronica. They end up smooching. Poor Betty's off to the side. But the shift here that I think is so important for Betty is that the reader knows she did it. This is the first time she's actually done something successfully. It hasn't worked out for her in the story, but we, the viewer,
Interesting.
know Betty has agency now. She accomplished what she wanted to accomplish, and we're seeing her in literally, but also figuratively, a more heroic light for the first time. So this is kind of a turn for Betty that starts towards some more growth for the character.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because reading it, it's very frustrating. It's that she keeps failing, and what you're saying about this other issue, it actually makes me think, what a missed opportunity, because in this, Archie falls off a cliff. Like it feels almost like it could have been a way of reversing or undoing that other story, but it's not, because everyone thinks that she must have fallen off the cliff too, and that Archie saved her, even though she saved him by pulling her ponytail and becoming Superteen. So how does that happen? Is there ever an explanation for why that happens?
No. I don't think there's an explanation for any of the superheroes. They just are. Archie can turn into Pureheart somehow. Jughead turns into Captain Hero. It's a gimmick so they can tell superhero stories.
Yeah. How often do we see Superteen?
Yeah.
For about a year or so in Betty and Me, and then every now and then they'll do a team up with like all of them. Yeah, it was popular for a couple of years. Then their other spoof on The Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Man from Riverdale, becomes more popular, and then Archie stars in that, and then Betty has her own as the girl from Riverdale and Betty and Me, and then that kind of takes over for a couple of years as their bigger pop culture spoof.
Yeah. And as Guido was mentioning a few times, she becomes Superteen by pulling her ponytail, which happens accidentally here. It gets trapped in a twig, and she becomes Superteen, and she looks just like William Catt as Real American Hero. She's got the red jumpsuit and like the white cape. And her powers are also it's hard to say what her powers are, because she can't fly, because she actually has jetpack belts that makes her fly. But then in the second story, she's able to transform her whole appearance into a Russian
into an
military
leader,
Russian
general.
Yeah, if you're looking for consistency in like canon of any kind, Archie Comics is not the place to start, much less the superhero stories. They're just whatever is necessary for the story to be funny is what's going to happen.
Yeah, because here too, and I mean, this I had to take as intentionally tongue-in-cheek, because Archie doesn't recognize Betty when she's wearing the Greatest American Hero outfit that she's wearing, which is ridiculous because it's not even like Clark Kent like there is no difference between Betty and Superteen other than she's wearing a red outfit. That is the only difference.
There's no mask. There's no hiding of the identity. It's just a different outfit.
No.
But I mean,
her hair is
not the same.
Yeah.
I think Jughead still wears the beanie when he's Captain Hero.
And in our first story, we get this accident that happens. Archie falls off a cliff, and Betty, as Superteen, saves him. But in our second story, we get actual antagonists, which are communists.
Geopolitical ones.
So they're trying to kidnap Veronica because her father is this rich industrialist. So one of the villains,
a Yankee capitalist.
Yeah, he hits them with some knockout gas, and then as you just said, Guido, he says, we get that Yankee imperialist lodge to do our bidding once we get his daughter behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, it's quite a grand motivation, and it's so huge. The first story is so small and is what I expect of Archie, like it's just some ridiculous thing that happens amongst them. And then in this one, as soon as they're like talking about getting the Yankee imperialist, I'm like, is this the same comic? Like, how did we suddenly become reflective of global affairs at the time?
It's really quite an escalation.
and it's funny too, because like you were saying, Tim, it's in that second story, really it's also all about Veronica, because she is the one they're trying to kidnap. So Betty, even though she is the hero, is still kind of off to the side because Veronica is who they're actually trying to get, and Archie's just kind of along for the ride.
Yeah, even as a superhero, she's like an incidental character. The villains aren't coming after her. She's just making sure Archie's okay all the time.
Yeah. And so is that always Betty's motivation in this era? Because I was really struck by the line at the end of the first story where she says, I'd like to spend my life looking after and protecting him. Is that really, like, does she really exist for Archie?
100%.
Oh.
That's all she cares about in this era. If you've read, more Archie comics over the years, you're kind of used to Betty as the more rounded character she'd become. She's becomes a really interesting character. Like, she's a really good mechanic. She's usually has all these like summer jobs and different things. She and Veronica get up to all kinds of different hijinks and adventures. But in this era, it's mainly try to get a date with Archie, try to take care of Archie, love Archie unreservedly, even though he has little to no interest in her whatsoever.
Threaten suicide.
Yeah.
Turn into a superhero. Yeah.
Whatever it takes. Yeah.
Well, speaking of superheroes, I wonder what if these characters met some other superheroes, or should I say supervillains. So let's start exploring multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
So this week we are asking the question, what if Archie Comics Betty and Veronica met DC Comics Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy? And this is from Harley and Ivy Meet Betty and Veronica from DC Comics and Archie Comics, issues 1 to 6 from December 2017 to May 2018.
And so these issues are written by Paul Dini, of course, co-creator of Harley Quinn, who brought in apparently Marc Andreyko, who was a big DC writer, particularly during the first 2 decades of the 2000s. They had worked together on the Love is Love LGBTQ comic anthology, and Paul said he wanted to enjoy this book as a fan, so he didn't want to write it. So they developed it together. Marc wrote it. Art is by Laura Braga and Adriana Mello. Laura Braga, a comic book artist still working for DC, Archie, and Marvel, artist on Bombshells, which we covered together, and Adriana Mello, a comic book artist for both major publishers, especially Star Wars stuff. The colors are by Arif Prenut, Tony Avinya, and Jay Nanjan. Letters are by Darren Bennett. And there are some wild cadre of cover artists on every issue. I mean, you have Jen Bartel, Tula Lotte, Jenny Frison, an Adam Hughes variant, and just so many others. The cover artists are very cool on this series. And so before, Tim, you give us a summary, I think, you can correct me, I think this is the first DC Archie crossover. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. There was the Marvel one in the 90s with the Punisher.
Yeah, so Archie meets Punisher had already happened. Archie would go on to meet Predator, would go on to meet all sorts of other people, and especially real-world bands in the more modern era.
Blondie, the B-52s, and Barack Obama.
And after this, they did Archie meets Batman 66. But I think this was the first DC Archie that I could find. And so, Tim, why don't you give us a little summary of the miniseries? There is a lot going on in it, so we'll dig in once you summarize it.
Yes, this is a DC Archie crossover in which Riverdale and Gotham City exist in the same universe. Very close to each other, it seems, like a short car ride away. It all kind of starts, Mr. Lodge is throwing a costume party. Betty and Veronica have decided to dress up as Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy. But the real Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy show up, in part because they're trying to avoid a loan shark back in Gotham City, but also because Mr. Lodge is building a development in Sweetwater on land that Poison Ivy is keen to protect. So Zatanna and Sabrina the Teenage Witch are both at this party. There is some magical shenanigans, and we get a body swap. Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy wake up in Riverdale as Betty and Veronica. Betty and Veronica wake up in Gotham City as Harley and Poison Ivy. So they have to navigate each other's life, the Gotham villain world for Betty and Veronica, high school drama for Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy. Ultimately, it turns out that Mr. Lodge is working with the same loan shark that Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy are having some trouble with on this new development in Sweetwater. So they all team up to defeat him, save the forest, and get switched back to their own bodies. In the end.
That is an awesome summary because these are dense 6 issues, surprisingly dense. Rob and I were preparing to read, and I was like, oh, it's an Archie comic, it's going to be a fast read. And then we got to this, and it was like, oh, never mind, not so fast. Yeah, so thank you for that. Gosh, I don't know where to begin. Who wants to start somewhere? Because there's a lot I want to unpack here.
Well, I'm just curious, Tim, what are your overall thoughts on this comic as an Archie expert?
As an Archie expert, it's kind of indicative of this era of kind of new Archie and the relaunch. As the comic starts, Betty and Veronica aren't on friendly terms whatsoever, which was kind of the norm for the new Archie stories for several years. There's the Mark Waid book. I think it's 30 issues or so before the girls ever speak a friendly word to each other.
Oh, gosh.
There's the Adam Hughes miniseries in which the girls are at odds the entire time. So their friendship is not a very big deal in these early books. And you can see that here. And it's over the course of researching Betty and Veronica, it becomes very clear Betty and Veronica stories are the worst when they're at odds. They work so much better together as best friends than as rivals.
Well, and all of those examples, including the series, are written by men who I think have an idea of what Betty and Veronica would be like, and that idea is probably a sexist trope of catfights.
We'll see after this future Betty and Veronica stories written by female authors where they're actually friends, and they're so much better. And then even Riverdale as well, which has like a ton of female writers and directors, you see a better take on Betty and Veronica. And you have the actors too, who very much care about that, because drawings on paper can't say, hey, you're kind of treating me poorly, but the actors can speak up for their characters and make it happen. But at this particular point in Archie's history, it's things aren't so great for Betty and Veronica. But then you throw in Harley and Ivy, and you get a whole dense, wacky adventure.
Yes, you do. I think it has. Your summary made me like it more than I did when I read it, because I like the ideas here are really fun. But one thing for me, this might not be a popular opinion even amongst the two of you, but I struggled. The art is great, but I kept thinking, gosh, if Dan Parent had drawn this book, I think I would have loved it. Like if it was drawn in the Archie Silver Age style, I think it would have really transformed my sense of it. But because it was drawn in really great art, but like a typical comic book style, which maybe had to do with the fact that they were using the relaunched versions of Archie, like you're saying, it kept taking me out of the absurdity of the plot. And like the two didn't feel like they worked in my brain, in my comic book brain. I couldn't reconcile those two things. So that was one wish.
The slapstick you should get from the combination of Archie Comics and Harley Quinn doesn't really hit in this style. Like Laura Braga and Adriana Mello, they're excellent artists, but it's the kind of expression and physicality you need for this to work, I don't think was there. It's a book that doesn't quite feel like a superhero book and doesn't quite feel like an Archie book. And
that's true.
Where they meld is something different that I don't know that it works entirely. It's fun. There's a ton of great cameos. It's weird and cool.
Yeah, I got a real cinematic feel to it. Even just hearing your summary, Tim, it reminded me of classic movies from the 80s, especially. I'm thinking something like a Who's That Girl, or something that has this kind of frantic, almost screwball comedy elements. And of course you got the body swapping as well, and then I'm experimenting with seeing each other's lives. So, and then the wacky villains, because we have a villain that has literally has a peach for a head. So, but just the frantic quality of it has that like What's Up Doc, Who's That Girl, screwball comedy feel, where there literally are car chases and stuff like that happening.
Yeah, something a little more cartoony might have worked better, like an Elsa Charretier, for example. Really
Yeah, that's a great idea.
The realism, like you said, they're trying to mimic the main Archie series, which had very realistic art. Like you see Jughead with his weird little hat, not the beanie.
Yeah, and his he had like the torn sleeves denim jacket. Yeah. That was the first moment where I realized, oh, this is using the modern versions. I hadn't really realized it other than the torn denim jacket.
Nobody has their like long noses, or they all look like normal people.
Yeah. But the villains, Rob, you mentioned that would fit into like an 80s screwball much better. I wanted to ask you, Tim, what is the deal with Larry? Is he Larry? Larry the Lamprey?
Lenny.
Do you have any idea what his deal is? Because I have a question. If you have,
I don't have a lot of knowledge on Lenny. I don't know that he exists elsewhere.
I don't think he does.
No,
and because we looked it up. But here's what I noticed on the cover of the Betty and Me that you had us read, and the first page, she is fighting a guy that looks to me like Lenny the Lamprey. He's bald and he has vampire teeth, and it's never explained. Wait, that's not it. That's different. It's never explained in the Betty and Me issue why she's fighting and this character that has these vampire teeth. And then I saw Lenny the Lamprey and I was like, oh my gosh, I think that's the guy from the Betty and Me comic. I don't know if Laura Braga or Marc Andreyko went back and found that reference, or if I'm making that up. But I was just curious, like, who's Betty and Me fighting? Does that make any sense to you, or no? Is that just generic guy with sharp fangs?
I think for that cover from the 60s, it's generic guy with sharp fangs, because he doesn't come up at all. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if for this story they saw that cover and were like, oh, let's kind of make a character in that vein flesh them
I'm
out more.
creating canon. Lenny the Lamprey's first appearance is 1966.
That
Betty
means
me.
they're worth so much more money now.
There's a little there's a little Dick Tracy-ness about them all because they all have a little an idiosyncrasy, but it also then reminds me of stuff like the Tick or Freakazoid, because the one guy can't stop laughing and the other guy literally has a peach for a head, which incites lots of peach-related puns and jokes throughout the issue, and then our main villain Lenny is very deformed. So yeah, it's kind of taking all those things of those classic weird looking villains.
There's other good 80s hijinks too, like Reggie dresses up as the Joker and gets hit on the head and then thinks he's the Joker for like the bulk of the mini from there on.
Yes.
Yeah, they're bringing all these fun elements together.
Yeah, I thought that directly felt so, again, that 80s thing of like all it takes is one bunk on the head and someone forgets who they are, and we've seen it in a million sitcoms. And I thought it was really clever to have Reggie, our antagonist kind of character, then become the Joker, and there's some great interactions with Harley Quinn. At one point she shouts "puddin'," but in fact it's because there's a giant table full of pudding that she just wants.
To eat. Yeah.
And there's lots of jokes, especially in that sequence when we get to the prom ball, whatever it is. There's lots of in jokes and references and just chock full of both Archie
Rob, you
and
pointed
DC
out
stuff.
I didn't know the Grundy reference. That's a great.
Oh my gosh, my favorite one, which I did laugh out loud because their teacher is Miss Grundy, and here she's Solomina Grundy, and she's talking about herself in the third person like Solomon Grundy, and that I did laugh out loud at. But Tim, you probably caught a lot more other little things there that we didn't catch. But what did you think about that kind of in-joke, almost meta-ness that a lot of this book has?
Yeah, I like that part the best, like the kind of chaos of seeing all the different characters, kind of who's dressed as who, all the jokes you can make with it. Josie and the Pussycats play at the show, and the real Catwoman shows up. Yeah. She's obviously a big Josie and the Pussycats
And I love
fan.
she said she's seen them 35 times.
They're her catnip.
Yeah. Even like the non-comic jokes, like Sabrina comes dressed as Marilyn Monroe, so she's in a pink dress and like a wizard hat, which is just a great little one-off gag. It's the kind of stuff you would expect from an Archie story, and maybe the kind of stuff you would expect from a Harley Quinn story as well. So like that sequence, I think works quite nicely.
That's true. It does combine those two tones where they overlap quite well. I didn't think about that with Harley's sense of humor too, and the way that her comics tend to read.
Also, I would totally read a Zatanna and Sabrina team up.
Oh my
I know.
gosh.
I was thinking that. I was thinking, gosh, that should have been like a whole issue. Is just the two of them. I would have preferred that over some of the like villain stuff in Gotham City.
And so, of course, another big part of this plot, as you explained, Tim, is this body swapping thing element. And so I mentioned this on our Josie and the Pussycat story. So my background with Archie is I actually worked for a production company, and we were developing the Archie Comics Broadway Musical, which never came to fruition. But when we were developing the story that we were coming up with was Betty and Veronica swap bodies with each other. And of course there's Sabrina, there's some magic, but it's Archie, so you can always have anything that also is magic. So, and of course I was so surprised. Oh my gosh, they're swapping bodies now with Poison Ivy and Harley. What is it about body swapping there? Has this happened before with these characters? Because it just seems like something so inherent. We mentioned 80s, so it's also built in there, but what is it about the body
Freaky
swapping?
Friday,
Yeah, anything you could think that might have happened in an Archie comic has happened in it. They put out a lot of stories. They will go through every trope humanly possible. But yes, there have been body swaps before. Betty and Veronica have swapped places a bunch. Trying to think if there have any been like kind of into other people. I don't know if they've ever switched with the boys.
that would be fun.
But yeah, Betty and Veronica have definitely swapped. They've done it. I think they did it a few times, like intentionally too. Like, take advantage of the Archie art quality in which all female characters look the same. Just swap the hair and they can replace each other. So I think there's been some.
Yeah. So a non-magical swap. It's like a wig swap.
It's been like a sort of a Prince and the Pauper kind of situation.
Oh yeah, totally. Yes.
Veronica's complaining about being rich. Betty's complaining about being poor. They swap for an issue and hijinks ensue. That kind of thing. So yeah, a body swap is not out of the norm for Archie, especially with Sabrina in the mix.
Well, while we're still thinking about every possibility that happened, here's what I'm wondering. We just covered Harley and Ivy and how Ivy especially has become just a queer icon and their relationship has been rendered explicit and how that's played out. Has there ever been a even homoerotic subtext about Betty and Veronica? Has that ever played out in anything modern? I would imagine it would be modern because they've been pretty progressive with Kevin Keller. I'd say that was really starting to break a lot of comic book boundaries. I know they have a trans character now. They do all these great one-shots where they're like sometimes horror, sometimes humor. So I'm just curious, have they ever played with that part of their relationship? Have you ever seen anything with that?
Yeah, until about 10, 15 years ago, Archie was an extremely conservative publisher. Like, the comics code from the 1950s is based on the Archie code, like their in-house code already.
Right,
so
right.
Their entire aim is to be as unobjectionable as possible. So in the vast swath of their history, this has not been a subtext whatsoever. There's kind of like joke covers. There's the famous one where Veronica and Archie come out of the tunnel of love, and Veronica's like smooched up, and Archie's like, "What's going on?" And you see Betty behind them also smooched up, suggesting that Betty and Veronica had kissing, and Archie missed it.
Oh, that's some good queer coding there. I like that.
But just very, very, very subtle joke things like that. The first episode of Riverdale, when the girls try out for the cheerleading squad, they have to do a routine and like they kiss at the end, and like the kiss was in all the ads for the first episode of Riverdale, and like sensationalizing it. It's instantly called out by Cheryl as like dumb queer baiting, and doesn't really come into play too much as the show goes on. There are a ton of queer characters on Riverdale, but Betty and Veronica together, not so much. I'm not as up on Archie Comics as I was when I finished writing the book, so that would have been like 2019. So I don't know if since they've played with it at all, but generally speaking, they're best friends. There's anything more than that. It's been hinted at most occasionally, but not really explored in any meaningful way, I don't think.
Yeah, it was just funny.
I got more of a hinting at through Zatanna and Sabrina in this issue, actually, of some kind of attraction between those two characters than I did get through Betty and Veronica there.
Yeah, they had chemistry. They were great.
Yeah, and they talk about like the magic history. So yeah, I agree. I think that's true. And it's clear here. I mean, even though Marc Andreyko is a queer writer, it's clear here that he's not writing Ivy and Harley together. At least explicitly on the page, they're not together in this. Obviously,
I was looking for that as I was reading through, because with the body swap, you're curious like how does that carry over, and there's not really anything particularly clear that they are together.
No, there's a few lines where it's like, oh, this is why I love you and that kind of thing, but you could definitely read that as being super close friends. It's kind of right on the line for a couple of lines of dialogue.
Yeah, I suppose at this point in history, DC was still kind of dancing around it too, were they not?
Yeah, I think it was around this time actually that they even had their first kiss, following their kiss in Bombshells, which is actually the first place they get to kiss on panel. So
Bombshells would have predated this, I think.
Yeah, that one did.
So, yeah.
But that was multiversal, and I guess this is multiversal too, because it's never explained why. What do you both think of that setup for a crossover story, and is that inherent in a lot of the Archie crossovers where it just is? They don't explain it. They don't send Archie through a portal. They don't do anything. It it just is that Gotham City is right there. I don't even know how he ends up meeting the Predator, but like, does that just happen?
Yeah. So like the Punisher one back in the 90s, Punisher was based in New York, and Riverdale just existed in the same universe. There was no one was going from one universe to the other. He was just there. I think the Predator one was similar. I think, isn't the Predator story like they go on an island vacation and there's like a predator in the woods or something? It's just there. There's no... Pretty much any crossover Archie does is just, for the purposes of this story, this is how it is.
Yeah.
It's not, much like the superpowers of the 1960s, it's what it needs to be for this present story. They're not going to spend a lot of time explaining the machinations that got us to this state.
Yeah.
My favorite point of the crossover, or one thing I really loved, maybe it's not my favorite, but I also love the connection between two other characters we haven't mentioned, which is Smithers, the Lodge family butler, and Alfred, the Wayne butler, who have a great connection because they were MI5 agents together, intelligence agents, and Smithers calls Alfred on the iconic Batman 66 red phone. And then when we get them driving away, we even get the line, "Atomic batteries to power, Hubie, turbines to speed, Alfie," the great line of dialogue from Batman 66.
There's another spin-off we need. Hubie and Alfie.
Yeah, that was clever because you read it and you think it's Harlan Ave, and there's like a couple Batman teases. Jughead's hat with the points kind of in shadow looks like Batman, and Harley and Ivy get freaked out a few times. So you kind of think, is Batman going to come? And then no, you get Alfred instead, and it's great because it's just this perfect connection to Smithers that was really clever and fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. All right.
Well, let us continue our exploration of these characters with our Pondering Possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted, averted?
So, Guido, what are we talking about for our Pondering Possibilities?
We're talking about a book by Tim Hanley.
Haha! Oh my gosh, I'm so surprised. Yes, and that book is Betty and Veronica, the Leading Ladies of Riverdale by Tim Hanley, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2020. But why are we talking about it just now, Guido? Is there something
Tim,
new?
you tell us.
Oh, yes.
Well, if you cast your mind back to 2020, kind of a busy year for everyone. Yeah. A few things fell through the cracks. The Betty and Veronica book came out then. Was, nicely received, but maybe you missed it because there are other things going on in 2020. Who knows what game distracted you then. But it's coming out again now as an audiobook from Last Word Audio. It's coming out July 17th. You can pre-order it now on Audible, iTunes, Amazon, and enjoy the book through your headphones as you relax on the beach this summer or kick back on the deck.
And that is the day this episode releases. Perfectly timed. It's meant to be. So tell us, before we get into the book and your expertise on these characters, tell us about I'm intrigued by the audiobook. Have any of your other books been turned into audiobooks? And how did it come about for this one? And who's reading it? And tell us.
Yeah, so my Wonder Woman book and my Catwoman book are both available as audiobooks. The Wonder Woman one was done by Last Word Audio and Colby Elliott, who does this one. We became like internet friends almost 10 years ago now when we did that one. But my publisher handled all of that. And then with the Betty and Veronica book, through whatever contractual weird things, I kept the audio rights. So I was talking with Colby a while ago, and we were talking about it'd be good to work together again. I was like, oh, hey, the Betty and Veronica book, I have the rights to this. Are you interested in doing it? And he gave it a read, liked the book, and was super keen to get it going. So he recorded it for me this spring. It's up on the 17th. We kind of wanted out just in time for Comic-Con, kind of build on that buzz. And yeah, he does a really great job reading it. He sent me the files to, check them over and make sure they're okay. And like, Colby's a pro. I know it's going to be good. So I thought I'll just dip in a little bit, kind of hear a couple bits I like, see how it is. And I started and I was like, wow, this is really good. I'm really enjoying it. And I listened to like 5 chapters in a row. And it's not because of the writing. Like the writing's, good, whatever. Like the way Colby reads it, like it really sucks you in, and it's very engaging and fun, and I think it's going to be a really good listen for everybody.
Yeah, and the cool thing about the summer too is everyone's going on road trips. I know Guido and I listen to a lot of audiobooks and things like that during the summer when you're in the car a lot and doing some day trips everywhere. So it's a perfect time for everyone to dive in back into Riverdale.
Well, and I love audiobooks like this because they're like, each chapter is like an episode of a podcast. Like to me, it almost is like this, your book with its 25 chapters, it's going to be a 25 episode podcast series. And that's really cool. So that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, it's fun. It can break up into nice manageable chunks. Each chapter is kind of its own distinct era, its own unique thing. So you can kind of put it down, pick it up again. It's I think it's a really accessible read and listen.
So rewinding a bit, why did you decide to write a book on Betty and Veronica?
Well, I'd done 3 books at that point, Wonder Woman, Lois Lane, and Catwoman. So we kind of get a superhero civilian, and then a super villain, kind of morally ambiguous character. So I kind of hit all the big things for superhero media, and I was trying to decide what to do next. And I had like a list of ideas of like other heroes we could do, other stuff. And I had Betty Veronica on the list, and Riverdale was just starting, and I was like, yeah, this is a good time for this, because we have 80 years of history, we have this new take on the character, we have the recent Archie Renaissance. It just felt like a really good time to look back and see how the characters have grown and evolved over the decades, how they relate to the way they're depicted now. And, I've always loved the characters. Getting to spend a year reading Archie comics was a dream job for me, basically. Because I go back and I read everything I can get my hands on. So it was just, like, literally a year straight of me reading comic books, having a great time, remembering a lot of the stories, because, like, I'd read them when I was a kid. It's like finding old classics that, like, hit that weird part in the back of your brain that, like, remembers it from when you were 6. So yeah, it was fun, it was timely, and it was something I'd always wanted to explore in more depth.
Amazing. And one thing I was thinking, actually reading this, Tim, and I was curious what your thoughts were when I was working for this company and we were developing the musical, what we found very quickly is that it was hard to actually center the musical around the character of Archie, because Archie doesn't really have a huge personality. A lot of what makes him a character actually is his indecision in many cases. And you get Jughead and Reggie have distinct personalities. Then, of course, Betty and Veronica have big personalities. And we really found ourselves shaping the musical around Betty and Veronica, and even asking the question, well, then what do we do with Archie? So my question really for you is, reading all of these and focusing on Betty and Veronica, really, should the series not be called Archie, but instead be called Betty and Veronica?
Archie's Gals.
Yeah. Archie Gals. Yeah.
Archie is usually the center of the story, but Betty and Veronica are often the catalyst for the story. So like whatever Archie does, it is in reaction to something Betty and Veronica have put into motion. Like Veronica wants to go to a dance and Archie can't afford it. He's double booked them and he has to manage them both together, that kind of thing. So yeah, they're like their own book, Archie's Girls, Betty and Veronica. When they do tell stories without Archie and they have their own hijinks, they're great. Like, they're great stories because they're such great polar opposite characters that are nonetheless best friends, and it just makes for fun, great storytelling. You can tell a fantastic Betty and Veronica story without Archie. I don't think you can tell a fantastic Archie story without Betty and Veronica.
Yeah, interesting. And even in this book, even in the Harley Quinn Poison Ivy book, you get Jughead as this great runner with, of course, eating, which is his thing, and Reggie gets this great thing with becoming the Joker, and Betty and Veronica are focused. Archie really, all of a sudden, when he came back in at the end, I'm like, oh wait, yeah, there's Archie.
Oh, he's a character.
Archie is also there. Yeah, I think you can see that too. Like if you watch Riverdale, they had to put a lot of things on Archie to try to make him an interesting character. Like he's the musical guy, he's the football guy. It took a while to figure out who he is in and of himself. And in the comics, he can be malleable. He can be, like in all these stories, whatever he needs to be for this particular story. But in something that's more consistent or contained like a musical or a TV show, he would need a specific characterization. And yeah, I can see how that would be hard to nail down, given that he's such a reactionary character to the other bigger, better fleshed out characters around him.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious too, of course the characters have grown and evolved over time, and I know they've moved away from this, but is it tricky to have these Archie stories where so much of the fundamental of who the Betty and Veronica characters are two women fighting over a man in this era? I know that was another kind of hurdle we had in trying to adapt the story, but how have you seen it evolve in that way, and does that still pose a difficulty in kind of the fundamental aspects, the building blocks of who these characters are?
Yeah, the modern stories, when done well, play with it, I think, in good ways. Like, the friendship comes first. Even if there is a rivalry, at the end of the day, you know it's not going to tear Betty and Veronica apart, that they both like this boy. So, like, a lot of the newer stuff it handles it well. Like we talked about with kind of the Archie relaunch, did not handle it well at all. It took really 4 or 5 years for them to figure it out. Even if you look back at something like Afterlife with Archie, that was such a hit and such a big change for the publisher. Betty and Veronica are very much background characters at odds throughout that entire book. But since then, they've kind of figured out that, yes, they need to be friends, put that at the forefront, and then kind of go from there. So whatever other story you tell, keep that as the kind of guiding light of the story. And that was a big shift for the characters in the late 80s. They canceled Archie's Girls, Betty and Veronica, and relaunched it just as Betty and Veronica. And the book was very intentionally shifted away from that whole Archie's Girls mentality. So they would fight over Archie, there would be the usual issues, but every story ended with Betty and Veronica on good terms. There was, I think, one story early on, Betty and Veronica were wearing the same dress to the dance. And it was going to be a big fight. 20 years ago, it would have been an absolute brawl. It would have been a mess. And when the dance comes around, they're each wearing different dresses. And this is the end of the story, is basically explaining our friendship is worth more than a dress. I'm not going to do it. And this is like, I don't know, 91, 92. So, but then it's again followed by Love Showdown. The Cheryl Blossom comes in. Archie finally decides it's a whole big thing in like 1993 was their big event book. So again, the rivalry comes back. So it was a back and forth, but Betty and Veronica comics, the ones with Betty and Veronica on the title, I think have really embraced this friendship. But looking back at the old stuff, it's like, yeah, I got nieces now. One of them's 5 years old. She can read a bit now. I'm like, do I want her to read kind of these old stories? And even like, what would she think of these old stories? Because like, she's growing up in a world where the idea that our girl can't do anything she wants is entirely foreign to her. Mm-hmm. Like, we read these stories together of like famous women who have done great things, and like that they have to overcome obstacles is like, what's going on? Like, she does not understand it at all. And so to expose her to like this world where there's just two gals fighting over a guy, I mean, I have a lovely book I can give her to contextualize it, so she
exactly. She can listen to it while she's developing her vocabulary.
But yeah, some of that older stuff does make you cringe a bit when you read it.
Yeah. I'm curious, as we wrap up, I have a final question for you. What is something you want to see from Betty and Veronica that we've never seen before, whether it be a story or maybe a medium or a creator, or like what's something that you wish for the future of these two characters?
I'd like to see something like long form with Betty and Veronica. We always get like a lot of miniseries, like smaller stories. I'd like to see kind of like a 4 years of high school thing, but like from Betty and Veronica's perspective, kind of navigating it all. That's written by someone who's modern and like not some old white guy they brought in from a superhero publisher. Like someone who understands the characters, who's modern and can really present a new take on the character that actually has some legs, that explores them in depth in a way I don't think we've really seen before. I think they deserve that kind of long form storytelling that we kind of see with an Archie focus elsewhere now with the Archie relaunch and stuff. But I think Betty and Veronica could really excel in that kind of format and present a really compelling story that I think a lot of teens, but then a lot of other folks would find really interesting and identifiable and enjoyable.
Yeah, I think that sounds like something, especially I teach in a girls' school, so that's something I would love to read and would appreciate if it was able to capture that voice and that experience and be written from a really authentic perspective. And there's a few writers out there I can imagine doing some of that work in the superhero realm. I'm sure there's non-superhero people who would be amazing, but I could imagine like Kelly Thompson or Leah Williams doing that really well. Or from non-superhero books, I mean, Alice Osman, they would be extraordinary. The creator of Heartstopper, I think they could do something really cool with characters like this. So I've got my fingers crossed that we get that ongoing you want from the right team. So that is a wrap. And Tim, could you tell listeners how they can find the audiobook and how they can download it, listen to it, support it, all that?
The audiobook is available this is going out day of, so it's available for order now on Amazon, on iTunes, and on Audible. Just search Betty and Veronica. It should be one of the first few things that come up. Not a lot of other folks have written Betty and Veronica books, and they don't do audiobooks, the comics. If you want more information, you can go to my website, thanley.wordpress.com, and I'm chatting about it a bit. I'm still clinging on to Twitter as it wanes in its final days, at Tim Hanley 01.
Great. And that's how people can stay up to date with other things you're working on for now?
Yep,
Excellent.
until Twitter dies and we end up somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. All right. Well, that is a wrap, dear watchers. Thank you for listening. I have been your brunette, Guido.
And I have been your blonde, Rob. The reading list is in the show notes, and you can follow us on the dying platforms and alive platforms and emerging platforms at Dear Watchers.
And leave a review, please, wherever you listen, and leave a review for Tim's books after you read them and after you listen to them. We'll be back soon for another trip through the multiverse.
And in the meantime, in the words of Owatu, keep pondering the possibilities.